I was camping in the Appalachian Mountains with 3 of my guy friends. We were all laughing and telling stories around the fire one night around midnight. The friend next to me grabbed my leg and pointed at the woods. We both saw a man's silhouette standing there. We called out to him, but he turned around and vanished from sight. We were 18, no cell service, and camp was all pitched up at midnight. Too late to search for another spot where we might get away from whoever it was, and too scared to search for him. We decided to sleep through the night there with 2-man watch teams. No signs of him for the rest of the night. We got out of the woods all right. 2 days later, 2 hikers were stabbed and killed by a mentally disturbed man who'd encountered them on a trail near where we were camping. Every now and then I wonder how close we came to having our cards punched that night by what could have been a knife-wielding murderer. My weirdest true story that's most likely not paranormal: waiting for a city bus one day, near an intersection. Perfectly normal day. Normal-looking car drives past. As it approaches the traffic light, I notice there's a murder of around 30 crows flying behind the car, like, 1 car length up in the air and 1 length behind. Car turns left at the traffic light. The crows turn left and follow it. Weirdest fucking thing, and I couldn't get my phone out in time to take a video. It's like if the crows were balloons on a 15-foot string, that's how tightly they were following that car. And it drives me crazy because I will never know what happened. Did the driver kill a crow? Was the driver a witch? What happened when the driver got out of the car, wherever they were going? 1 grew up in a funeral home. I helped out in the office. When I was about 15, we got a call from a man whose wife and infant baby had been murdered in cold blood. There were very few clues. It made headlines. Cops set up surveillance at the viewing. It was heartbreaking, as the mother was holding the baby in her arms. I was asked to take the flower cards and periodically get the husband and ask if he recognized the names. I then photocopied them and put them back. I did it because I was a kid, people knew me, and I was unobtrusive. I talked to the husband quite a bit. He seemed devastated and shaken. The cops told me they had an eyewitness to someone leaving the house the day of the murder. The witness was a 3-year-old girl. She recognized the man leaving. It was the husband's best friend. Turns out that the friend and the husband had made a pact to kill each other's families and run off with their secretaries. The little girl identified the friend, and I guess one of them cracked. They both went to jail on multiple counts, all on the testimony of a 3-year-old. I still cannot believe to this day that that man stood right beside me, multiple times, and I had no clue. I don't think I ever looked at life the same way after that. James Bulger. He was just 2 years old and with his mom running errands. She let go of his hand to pay the cashier, and he wandered away. 2 10-year-old boys spotted him, lured him toward them, took him by the hands and led him away. They took him to a remote location, pushing and kicking at him the whole time. Some people questioned the 2 kids with the crying toddler, but they lied saying he was their brother and nobody intervened further. They took him to a secluded spot and tortured him. I don't want to recount the torture details, it's just too gruesome. They left his body on some railroad tracks hoping that being run over by a train would make it look like an accident. He was found days later, his body severed in half by a train. The boys were caught and became the youngest convicted murderers in British history. Security footage from the day they took James shows them watching children, picking out a target. And they were just kids themselves. They were released at 18. One of them is back in jail for possessing child abuse photos on his computer. The most terrifying thing about this for me is that my own son is only 2 now, and James's murderers were just children, too. It was premeditated and intentional and entirely random. Just a momentary lapse in attention and he became a target of 2 murderous children. Children. To think that children younger than my stepson are capable of such a thing. Ugh. Everything about this case is just horrifying. My dad worked in a morgue during college in the 60s. One time on the night shift he was training a recent hire who was wheeling a body down the hallway. The body was under a sheet but all of a sudden started to sit up. The guy immediately freaked out, ran out the doors and quit. Apparently a dead body can have muscle contractions in the abs causing it to start sitting up. The more you know, I guess. The scariest true story I know is my own. I grew up with a very mentally ill and abusive father. The summer I was 16 and my younger brother was 13, my father shot my brother with a shotgun at almost point-blank range in our basement. Thankfully, it missed his heart by 2 inches and he is still alive today. I came home that evening to find my stepmother cleaning the blood off the tile floor like there was nothing to see. It was the most terrifying and surreal thing I've ever experienced. One would believe attempted murder would be enough to terminate custody rights, but alas the police chalked it up to accidental and my brother and I were too frightened of our father to say otherwise. At 18 and 15, respectively, My brother and I packed up and left the state, never to speak to our father again. To this day, little bits of shrapnel still surface in my brother's chest. The New London school explosion. A school in Texas in 1937 tried to tap into natural gas on their own, and it ended up leaking and blowing up the school. It's the reason they make natural gas scented in Texas and probably the US now. I'm amazed I never heard of this in school because it seems like something that should be taught. I read some survivor stories and I had fucking nightmares. It was horrible. 3 in particular stuck with me. One was a 7 or 8-year-old girl. She saw her best friend and playmate with her entire body crushed by concrete with only her shoulders and head above it, and she still had a lollipop in her mouth like she didn't know what happened. Another was a guy, I think a 16 to 17-year-old, helping undig people and bring them out of the wreckage. He saw a dad holding his daughter crying his eyes out while the back of the girl's head was broken open with her brain on the ground next to her. The last was a 9-ish-year-old girl who went to find her mom after it happened. There was a PTA meeting going on at the time, so there was a lot of parents at the scene. Her mom was freaking out trying to find her but didn't even recognize her. She went up to her mom and called out to her, but she just kept saying, "You are not my daughter." She was so covered in blood and ash and tears that her own mother couldn't recognize her. It was a truly horrifying thing. I lived next to a murderer. Faye Sweatlick was 6 years old when she was kidnapped out of her front yard. It was all over the news. I had news crews, cops, even the FBI all over my townhouse complex. My fiancé and I met with the FBI 3 times. They searched our home and everything. I remember clear as day, my fiancé FaceTimed me as the cops were digging through the trash cans directly in front of my townhouse. They pulled out her boot and a bloody knife. Then they found her body, dumped maybe 300 feet from my house. He had watched them find the murder weapon. Dumbass put it in a trash bag along with his other mail. He went to his back porch and opened his own throat. It's crazy. I had conversations with the guy. I never knew he was a psycho. This all happened a year ago. This one kid back in the early 20th century named Bobby Dunbar. He went missing, and after like a year of searching for him, his parents came across a man with a kid who looked a lot like Bobby. They believed it was their kid, and after a legal battle with the kid's supposed mother, they brought the kid home. A Wallace parade happened due to the missing kid's return. He lived and died believing he was, in fact, Bobby Dunbar. Well, a few decades later, his granddaughter asked Bobby's nephew, I think, for a DNA sample so she could see if her and Bobby's nephew were related. Turns out, they weren't. Meaning the real Bobby Dunbar is still missing and probably died alone without his parents. When I was 71, was raking rocks in my aunt's front yard and a beat-up pickup truck pulled up. The man got out, fiddled with something under the hood and then closed it. He asked me, "Hey kid, do you know how to pop a clutch?" Spending my childhood on a farm, I did indeed know how. "Yes," I responded. "Give me a hand real quick," he said. So I started walking towards his truck. At the last second my mom called out to me from the garage and I turned around to see what she wanted. I heard the door slam, the truck start, and he drove away. That memory never really came up until one day, about 30 years later. I jump up after laying down to go to bed when out of nowhere it came back and it hit me. This guy was trying to kidnap me. What the fuck? What bullet did I dodge? I mean, you ever have a memory come back and you get scared? I mean, scared over the memory? I was shaking for at least a half hour over it. It still freaks me out thinking about it. A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up out there. The plan was her husband and daughter would fly over first and she would fly over a week or two later due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. Her husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferryect. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter was found dead by authorities a few days after she rang, explaining she was concerned for their welfare as she had had no contact with them and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change. Happened to my boss's best friend when they were around 17. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend and she had the house to herself. Went about her business having dinner, watching TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side she was laying/facing, gently stroked her hair and face, then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in the foresty area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff. If I recall correctly, this happened somewhere in Alabama, most likely mid-2000s.